Can everybody hear sufficiently? Yes? Okay, great. Just want to welcome you to the University of Chichester. I know lots of you have come from very far and wide, so we're thrilled to have you all here. This conference is inspired by the seminal book, The Fabled Coast, written by Sophia Kingshill and the late Jennifer Westwood, whose family we're very honoured to have here with us today. Fabled Coast is a compendium of folk stories and legends from around the shores of Britain and Ireland. But as the geographical range of people who've come today to the conference has shown, our fascination with stories, I think, is about the coast, is universal. We are thrilled that so many of you have come. Oh, hi. Come on in. We're thrilled that so many of you have come from far and wide, and to share this fascination with us and to engage in what we hope is going to be a wonderful day of really a great discussion and sharing of knowledge. I should say that actually amongst us there's 10 different countries represented, which is wonderful. So I hope we all mingle during the teas and coffees and the lunches later. It's a real privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, renowned folklorist Sophia Kingshill, who, as well as co-authoring The Fabled Coast, has written extensively on folk topics associated with the sea and shore, including The Sunken Galleon of Tobermory and The Search of a Fabulous Island, High Brazil, as well as her monograph Mermaids, which I think you're going to get a nice taste for during this keynote speech. And all of Sophia's books, I should say, are available in our shop at the front when you came in, if you want to make any purchases later, along with the Chichester Centres for fairy tale, folklore and fantasy. We've got our journal Grammary there as well, so if you want to peruse those later on as well, feel free. Sophia is also a playwright and a fiction writer, so I think she's the perfect person to set us off today into our foray into fabled coasts around the world. So if I hand over to Sophia now, and I wish you all a very warm welcome to Chichester. So, great.
What do we mean when we talk about mermaids? The answer might seem obvious. Here's a picture of some mermaids. That's what a mermaid is. A woman with a fish's tail. The word mermaid, though, doesn't imply anything more specific than water woman. Maid, female, mer, water. And by the way, it's not la mer, as in French, the sea. It's from the Old English mere, which can mean sea, lake, or pond. So a mermaid is a creature, a female creature, that can inhabit either salt or fresh water. And as for her resemblance or relationship to a fish, that's not a straightforward matter. The mermaid's family tree is complicated. Like all of us, she has some unexpected ancestors and a few peculiar cousins. From the very beginning, the record is confused because mermaids have a dual origin. On the one hand, there are ancient images of creatures with human torsos and fishes' tails. This figure from Mesopotamia, for example, dating from the 8th century BC. He was probably a divinity, and from later centuries, descriptions survive of a Syrian goddess, Atargatis, and a Babylonian god, Oannes, both of whom had fishy lower halves. These are what we would now call mermen and mermaids. But then there are the sirens. Today, the word siren is used to mean more or less the same as mermaid, and that's nothing new. Here's a definition from around 1300 years ago. Sirens are sea girls who deceive sailors with the outstanding beauty of their appearance and the sweetness of their song, and are most like human beings from the head to the navel, with the body of a maiden, but have scaly fishes' tails with which they always lurk in the sea. But sirens are a lot older than that, and to begin with, they weren't anything like mermaids. The earliest sirens, dating back 3,000 years or so ago, are shown not with fishtails, but with wings. They appear on tombs and seem to have had a function as guides of dead souls to the underworld. The first narrative we have about the sirens is from the 8th century BC in Homer's Odyssey. The hero Odysseus, trying to sail home from Troy, is warned by the beautiful witch Circe of the dangers that await him. First, she says he'll come to the sirens, who enchant all men with their sweet song. No one escapes from their island. Bones of their victims lie around them. So plug your sailors' ears with wax and have them tie you to the mast so you can't get free if you want to hear the sirens' voices for yourself. Odysseus does as he's told and is the only man who hears the sirens and survives. Now, Homer gives no physical description of his sirens. Their sweet voices aren't just the most important thing about them, they are the only characteristic that they have. Essentially, all they are is song. They might as well not have bodies, whether of fish or bird or anything else. But Homer's audience knew what sirens looked like. They were winged beings with human heads, and that's the way they appear in illustrations of the Odyssey for many hundreds of years. And if you think about it, that makes more sense of the singing. Bird song is something we all know about. Fish song, not so much. So what changes? How do the sirens become mermaids? The answer is speculative, but it seems to have something to do with Scylla, who is also in the Odyssey. She is the next danger that Odysseus has to face after he's got away from the sirens. And Homer describes her as a terrifying monster like a mutant octopus, with 12 feet which she hides in the waves, and 6 barking dogs' heads. But later writers and artists made her less bizarre and scary, with just 1 human head and no feet at all, just a fish's tail, or sometimes 2 tails, a hint at her original multiplicity of legs. Now, there's a different legend about Scylla, dating from a few centuries after Homer's time. According to this story, Scylla started out as a beautiful sea nymph, entirely normal, no extra heads, no tentacles, and a fisherman named Glaucus fell madly in love with her. But Glaucus himself was not normal. He had eaten a magic herb that had changed his legs into, guess what, a fish's tail. Scylla didn't find that very attractive, so Glaucus thought that he would try a love potion. He asked for help from the witch Circe. That's the same Circe who comes into the Odyssey. But Circe was jealous because she fancied Glaucus herself, and so instead of an aphrodisiac charm, she put a spell on Scylla that changed her into a monster. That legend doesn't mention the sirens, but it contributes to a kind of subliminal network of association around Scylla and Circe and people with fishes' tails. And Circe comes into the Odyssey just before the sirens, and Scylla comes immediately afterwards. And what seems to happen is that artists illustrating the ancient myths in classical Roman times and later don't quite remember which character is which. Ravishingly beautiful, sings enchantingly. Was that Circe or the sirens? Eats men alive, lives in the sea, something funny about the legs. Wasn't that the sirens? I'm not making this up. We know people got confused. In the Divine Comedy, for example, Dante clearly misremembers his classics, making his siren claim that she turned Odysseus from his road, which she didn't, but Circe did. And Dante probably had a text to check from, which the sculptors and painters of 1,000 years earlier almost certainly did not. And even if their memory was crystal clear, those artists had a good reason for changing the sirens' appearance. Function dictates form. What do the sirens do? They tempt, attract, entice. The way they do that is with their voices, and if you're telling a story, you can say the sirens sang so sweetly that nobody could resist them. But in a picture, you want to show the temptation. And a fat, feathered pigeon just isn't very enticing. But stick a curvaceous female upper half on top of a sinuous fishtail or 2, and you're in business. The change took time, lots of time, for around 1,500 years, from the 7th century BC to the 7th or 8th century AD. The most common form of the siren was the half-bird creature. The mermaid siren first appeared in the 3rd century BC, and little by little over the next millennium became more and more popular until around the 8th century AD, she overtook her bird-bodied sister and became the standard way to depict a siren. Throughout this period, there are plenty of marine beings around who are not sirens. There are sea nymphs, who are usually shown with legs, and there are tritons, males with tails. In fact, in the classical world, fish-tailed men far outnumbered fish-tailed women. But when we hit the medieval period, mermen all but vanish, and they haven't made a comeback since. Almost uniquely in the supernatural menagerie, sea spirits are assigned a primary female gender. We talk about mermaids much more readily than we do about merfolk, and the vast majority of images from the Middle Ages onwards show a feminine form. That's largely because in medieval art and theology, the siren came to symbolise sin and temptation. Why are there so many images of mermaids in churches, cathedrals and monasteries? Well, partly because medieval craftsmen liked carving and painting women with bare breasts, and monks and other clerics mostly liked looking at them. But also, or rather as a natural development from that theme, the siren carried with her an accepted religious message. She warned against the lures of the devil. And this is another reason why she changes from half bird to half fish. It makes her a much better metaphor. With a winged creature flying in the air or perched on a rock, you can see all of it. You can tell it's not human all the way down. But a mermaid, when she's hiding her tail in the sea and has just her top half showing, looks like a real woman. A man has to get up close before he finds out that below the water, her private parts are a disappointment and a dead end. He might lust after a siren, but he won't get anywhere with her. Her promises, like those of Satan, are never fulfilled. That symbolic meaning is set out in medieval bestiaries, illustrated books that combined natural history with Christian theology, attributing good and evil qualities to various real and mythical beasts. A phoenix, for example, was an image of resurrection, while a pelican, which was thought to feed its young on blood from its own breast, meant self-sacrificing divine love. And as for the siren, according to a French bestiary from the early 13th century, so sweetly does she sing and well, that they who go sailing on the sea, as soon as they hear that song, cannot forbear from letting their ship approach. So soothing seems the song to them, that in their ship they fall asleep, and when they are so fast asleep, then they are deceived and trapped, for the sirens kill them without their uttering shriek or cry. The author goes on to explain that vices such as gluttony, lust, and avarice are snares of the devil, who lulls our souls asleep. Then he attacks us, then he falls upon us, then he kills us, then he does us to death, just as the sirens do to the mariners who sail the seas. Here, then, the siren represents all sin, but in a self-reinforcing progression, the more attractively she is illustrated, the more she is associated with bodily desire, and so the more sexualized her imagery becomes. Here's another 13th century description of the siren. A beast of the sea, wonderfully shapen as a maid from the navel upward, and a fish from the navel downward. And this wonderful beast is glad and merry in tempest, and sad and heavy in fair weather. With sweetness of song, this beast maketh shipmen to sleep, and when she seeth that they be asleep, she goeth into the ship, and ravisheth which she may take with her, and bringeth him into a dry place, and maketh him first lie by her, and do the deed of lechery, and if he will not or may not, then she slayeth him, and eateth his flesh. There's a problem here, a rather obvious one. How, given that this female is a fish from the navel downward, could any man do the deed of lechery with her? That question is key to an awful lot of later legend, and I'll come back to it shortly. Here, though, is a place where the mermaid's history divides into two quite distinct paths: mythology, romance, and sexuality on the one hand, and on the other, cryptozoology, that is, generally the scientific investigation of legendary beasts, and in this case, mermaids considered as real living creatures that could be observed, caught, and, as so often in man's interaction with nature, exploited for profit. Over very roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, Western thought became less preoccupied with religion and more concerned with exploration and celebration of the natural world. Images of the siren continued to appear very frequently, but without their symbolic freight of meaning. A picture of a fish-tailed woman is no longer suggested damnation, but was simply ornamental. She appeared very often on sea charts, and that could lead to misunderstanding. 15th and 16th century sailors exploring distant oceans, finding their maps embellished with mermaids, might not unreasonably assume that in some remote part of the globe they could come across the genuine article. Christopher Columbus recorded in his journal for January 1493 that when exploring the Rio Yaque del Norte in what is now the Dominican Republic, he saw 3 sirenas, mermaids, who rose high out of the water. He noted that these sirens were not so fair as they are painted. No, they weren't, if they were dugongs, which still live in that river. Dugongs and their relatives manatees have been claimed to be the whole foundation of the mermaid belief, but that's getting things back to front. Nobody seeing one of these creatures would imagine a mermaid if they didn't already have mermaids in mind. They certainly wouldn't get any romantic ideas about them. At least so I'd have thought, but perhaps I'm wrong. In the Red Sea area, writes Elaine Morgan, there is an oral tradition that in former centuries a sailor, after months at sea, who found a dugong in the shallows, large, docile, warm-blooded, air-breathing, smooth-skinned, female-breasted, and with ventral, that is frontal, genital organs, which remarkably well fitted his own, wouldn't worry over much if she was comparatively faceless. Such a sailor, of all people, would have been able to judge that what he had mated with was wholly animal. Dugongs and manatees are known collectively as Sirenians, showing how closely they've been identified with the mermaid or siren myth. Calling a dugong a mermaid means no more really than calling a rhinoceros a unicorn, as some early travellers did, because they didn't have any other name for what they were seeing. But in the case of mermaids, sometimes you have to wonder just what people were seeing. Here, for example, is a picture from an illustrated guide to the sea life of Indonesia, printed in 1717. The caption, in French, calls the creature a monster resembling a siren and records its length as 59 inches, that's nearly 5 foot long. It was kept in captivity for 4 days, so the artist had plenty of time to look at it, and I suppose all you can say is that he saw what he expected or wanted to see, or at any rate drew what people back home hoped he might have seen. Who knows, really? One modern naturalist has guessed that it might have been a young dugong, but it doesn't look a lot like one to me. Some supposed mermaids were encountered in far northern waters, where no dugong or manatee could have been living. Here, seals and walruses are the most likely candidates for a mistaken identification, but again, a lot of wishful thinking must have coloured the descriptions. Exploring Newfoundland in the early 17th century, Captain Richard Whitbourne saw a strange creature which very swiftly came swimming towards me, looking cheerfully on my face as it had been a woman. By the face, eyes, nose, mouth, chin, ears, neck and forehead, it seemed to be so beautiful and in those parts so well proportioned. This, I suppose, was a mermaid or merman. The point is really that sailors were conditioned to expect mermaids in real life because they saw so many of them as art, not just on their maps, but carved as figureheads on their ships or tattooed on each other's arms. Again, this isn't only or even mainly because the mermaid is a symbol of anything in particular, but because she's a half-naked woman. We have to accept that men like tits, and all male communities, monks in monasteries or sailors on ships, take them where they can find them. One unintended result of that was that European ideas about mermaids were spread wherever Europeans explored and colonised. Although there's probably no region of the world that doesn't have its own indigenous water spirits, the fair-skinned, fish-tailed mermaid or siren, with her comb and mirror, is a Western product whose image was carried to other continents by merchants, missionaries and slave traders. And a quick word, by the way, about that mirror. One of the earliest images I've shown you today, this pigeon-like specimen from the 6th century BC, is holding a looking glass. So it's been the siren's accessory for a very long time. One suggestion is that the mirror originally symbolised the moon, itself a symbol for womanhood, think monthly cycle, and linked, of course, to the sea. And as for the comb, both the Greek word for comb, kteis, and the Latin pecten can also refer to the pudenda. On early Christian monuments, a double motif of comb and mirror signifies that the person referred to is a woman. So both mirror and comb, in relation to the mermaid, reinforce the notion of her archetypally female nature. But now I'll get back to the mermaids that early travellers thought they really saw. In the days of sail power, and before reliable weather forecasting, ships at sea were very much at the mercy of the elements, and sailors paid attention to a wide range of weather signs. Any unusual phenomenon was generally a threat, and a sighting of a mermaid was especially ominous, a warning or even the cause of terrible storms. A 15th century painting of a saint calming a tempest shows a retreating mermaid, small, bottom left, as pictorial shorthand for the dropping of the wind. However, actually to catch a real live mermaid would have made a fortune for the lucky fisherman. In The Tempest, Trinculo is thrilled when he meets Caliban. "A strange fish, were I in England now, not a holiday fool there, but would give a piece of silver." The public back home were eager to see whatever excitingly alien animals were brought from abroad, and for several centuries it was common to find so-called mermaids or strange fish, alive or dead, displayed at fairgrounds or in exhibitions. Some were more convincing than others. In the Gentleman's Magazine of 1775, there appears an exact drawing of a siren or mermaid, now exhibiting in London, whose accompanying description notes her fine blue eyes, small handsome nose, rounded lips, and general features and complexion of an European. Instead of hair, she had a beautiful membrane or fin on her head, and she had, we are told, breasts but no nipples and a belly but no navel. Evidently the writer was aware of biological problems inherent in a mammal-fish hybrid, but the illustrator has taken no notice of that and has given her both nipples and navel. What reality, if any, was behind this particular fantasy, we don't know, but it's well recorded that a whole cottage industry sprang up in the 18th and 19th centuries, creating mermaids and mermen. The centre of the trade was in Japan, where creatures like this were produced. The common report was that they were constructed by sewing the bottom half of a fish onto the top half of a monkey, but modern analysis shows that they could be made up of body parts from a whole range of creatures, including chickens' claws and even human teeth. These hybrids were literally fish, flesh, and fowl. One Japanese fisherman came up with a brilliant story to promote his supposed catch. He said that the ningyo, as these beings are called in Japan, had survived for a short while out of water, long enough to prophesy that the whole country would soon experience a terrible epidemic disease. The only cure for that disease, according to the ningyo, as reported by the fisherman, would be a picture of the ningyo itself, and luckily the fisherman had plenty of pictures for sale. The most notorious of these artificial beasts was a specimen owned by the showman Phineas Barnum and shown by him in the 1840s as the Fiji mermaid. From descriptions and engravings, it's clear that the animal was no beauty. It had thin black hair on the head, lips and chin, it was scaly all over, and its face was horribly contorted. Barnum's advertising was a triumph of what he himself called humbug, which he defined as the art of attracting attention whether the article is good or bad. This is a report of a lecture in which Barnum explained his success. He had an elaborate and really beautiful picture painted, which he hung outside the museum. The picture represented 3 lovely creatures with beautiful long hair, but he did not say his mermaid was like those in the picture. Attracted by the picture, and notice, a mermaid is added to the museum, no extra charge, thousands paid to go in, and then they saw a hideous, shriveled-up old mummy, and if people were not satisfied with the mermaid, they had their shillings worth in looking at the rest of the museum. Mr. Barnum confessed that he did not pursue his studies in natural history too far, or he might learn too much. But none of these commercial fakes and frauds would have flourished without a background of belief, or at least familiarity, with romantic narratives about mermaids. So now I'll backtrack from 19th century exhibitions past 16th century exploration back to where we left the legendary siren in the Middle Ages. The early medieval siren of the bestiaries, a largely symbolic presence, had had little interaction with mankind other than tempting them and eating them. From around the 13th century, however, as knowledge of classical mythology became more general, that led to cross-fertilization with Greek and Roman legends of metamorphosis, gods, goddesses, and nature spirits who could transform their appearance and enter into close relationships with human beings. The question I left dangling a little while ago, how does a woman with a tail have sex, was answered in a development of legend dealing with women who only had tails some of the time. Most influential of these was Melusine. An early version of her story was recorded by Gervase of Tilbury, who writes that Raymond, Lord of Rousset in Provence, one day met a lovely woman by the river Lar. Struck by her beauty, he began in the usual way to urge her in a gallant speech to give way to his desire. She held out for marriage, promising that he would enjoy good fortune as long as he never saw her naked. Raymond agreed, and as she had foretold, he led a successful and happy life. After several years, however, he was suddenly overcome by the wish to look at his wife in her bath. "Why prolong my tale?" asks the writer. The knight, burning to see his wife naked, snatched away the curtain which screened the bath. The lady immediately turned into a serpent. Plunging her head under the bath water, she disappeared and was never seen again. Unnamed in this early version, the lady was later known as Melusine. In the late 14th century, legends about her were collected in a long verse romance, telling essentially the same story, although the ban on Raymond ever seeing his wife naked becomes a prohibition against seeing her at all on a Saturday, the day when she turns into a snake. The fateful revelation still takes place while she is washing herself. Down to her navel, she had the form of a woman, gracefully combing her hair, but from the navel down, her body had the form of a serpent's tail. As big around as a barrel for storing herring it was, and tremendously long. She lashed the water so forcefully with the tail that it made it splash all the way up to the vaulted ceiling of the chamber. Seeing this, Raymond felt a great sadness. Note that Melusine, although she always appears by a river or a spring and is revealed in her hybrid form when in her bath, is described not as half fish but as half serpent. In fact, many writers of the medieval and Tudor periods regard the siren as akin to snakes rather than fish. For example, Philip Sidney remarks that poetry, with its siren's sweetness, draws the mind to the serpent's tail of sinful fancies. Serpent or siren, Melusine has always been classed among the mermaids. She's unusually powerful, more goddess than nymph, and more significant in terms of mermaid lore is that here we have a water spirit in direct, intimate marital relationship with a man. That idea carries through to a whole swathe of later legends about water spirits who take human husbands or lovers, traditions that once again travel down separate paths. One type of story deals with women who, like Melusine, can be human or not so human at different times. Popular folklore explains this in terms of a magical garment or charm which the nymph has to possess in order to live underwater. That immediately makes her vulnerable, much more vulnerable than Melusine, because if her garment or charm is stolen, then she's trapped on land in human shape. She is then at the mercy of whatever man has taken her talisman to be seduced, or, to put it bluntly, raped and forced into marriage. The magic garment might be a tail, understood in this case as something that can be taken on and off like a skirt, or it might be an enchanted cap or cloak, or even a whole animal skin. In places where seals were common, Ireland, the Western Isles of Scotland, Scandinavia, a distinctive branch of legend developed about selkies, people who could live in the water as seals, but who on land took off their furry skins and were then bewitchingly desirable human-shaped men and women. The basic story of the sea bride goes like this. A man sees a beautiful naked woman on the shore. He realises that she must be a mermaid or a selkie, and so he finds and hides her sealskin, or her cap, or her cloak, or her tail. Without that, she can't go back to the sea, so she has no choice but to marry the man. The marriage is happy, at least from the husband's point of view, and usually there are children. But one day, always, the wife finds her cloak or whatever it is, and then immediately she returns to the water. There are infinite variations on this plot, which is an international migratory legend, meaning that it's found all over the place in different versions. In Russia, the wives are more often swan women. Further east still, there are Chinese tales of dragon brides. The essential point is that the mermaid is half animal. The husbands capture and tame them into wholly human form, but as soon as the women get a chance, they reclaim their animal selves and go back to their own world. There's also a different sort of metamorphosis, originally human girls who die young and are reborn as supernatural water spirits. Again, this is usually to do with their love lives. It's after a woman is betrayed by a man that she commits suicide, and then in a sort of payback is transformed into a vengeful being who in her turn leads men to their doom. One example from Russia is the rusalka, a creature said to haunt pools deep in the forest where she lures and drowns unwary travellers. She is said to resemble a waterfowl, and this 19th century picture shows a group of rusalki who are actually white-clad women, but could easily be mistaken for a cluster of nesting swans. It's interesting that Slavic and East European nymphs have stayed closer to the original image of the bird siren, giving a link to one of the most famous Russian stories, Swan Lake. Then in Germany we have the Lorelei. That was originally, and still is, the name of a rock on the River Rhine, which was said to be haunted by a female spirit. In the early 1800s, a ballad was composed about a fisherman's daughter, seduced and abandoned, who then became a malignant sorceress. Her favourite place, from which she took her name, was the Lorelei Rock. There she sat, singing so beautifully that the sailors of the Rhine forgot to steer clear, wrecked their boats and drowned. Another German nymph was Undine, heroine of a novella published in 1811. In this romance, a man falls in love with a water spirit, but then becomes uneasy at the thought that his wife is not of his world and curses her. She dives into the river Danube and disappears, and a little while later, the husband marries again, despite a dream warning him that he will lose his life if he does so. Immediately after his second wedding, Undine returns to him, and as she kisses him, he dies. Now, this is not based on any popular folk tale, but instead takes its plot very precisely from a passage in the writings of Paracelsus, a Swiss scholar of the early 16th century. Paracelsus, in fact, coined the word undine for a water nymph, from the Latin undar, a wave, and described how a man's relationship with one of these beings might, or indeed, according to him, often did proceed. If a nymph is married to a man, he wrote, and they happen to be in a boat and he offends her, she will throw herself overboard and disappear. She might as well be dead for him, he never will see her again. Yet she is not dead, and he still is wedded to her. He cannot lawfully take another wife, for he is not divorced. He is bound to her for eternity, though she has departed from husband and children. If the man should nevertheless take another wife, the nymph will kill him, which has happened many times. Don't forget Paracelsus. You might not think that a 16th century alchemist would have much to do with modern mermaids, but in fact he's been a vital influence on the tradition, and I'll be coming back to him in a few minutes. Meanwhile, though, we now have several different forms of mermaid-like being. Melusine with her serpent's tail, Selkies, half seal, half human, and a variety of women, Undine, Rusalka and Lorelei, who inhabit the water at least some of the time and tempt men with their beauty and their singing. In all their breeds, mermaids, sirens and sea nymphs became favourite subjects for 19th century artists who exploited the legends for their erotic potential. Consider, for example, William Waterhouse's Mermaid, essentially an early page 3 girl, exposed above, unavailable below. Some painters imagine their nymphs with legs rather than tail. In order not to be too explicit, then, they have to contort their models in postures that show their backsides rather than their genitals, but still give a hint of breast. This is The Kiss of the Siren by Gustav Wertheimer, and here's Pierre Dupuy's Ondine playing in the waves, both examples of Victorian porn at its most suggestive. One critic commented about the Dupuy picture that this is not the cruel siren who with her perfidious chants lures the sailors only to drag them down into her deadly grottos, but rather the merely playful Ondine, who does not look for victims and who is the innocent flower of the sea's deep garden. She doesn't look all that innocent to me, but she's certainly playing submissive. An upright nude, on the other hand, is empowered. Compare Edward Burne-Jones's Depths of the Sea. His mermaid is a real ball breaker. The man droops above her limp, but she is erect. That's only possible, of course, because she's underwater where she can stretch her tail straight down. On land, the man is the one in control, but in water, the woman's element, the balance of power shifts, and she gets to call the shots. In all cases, in folktale or painting, as Melusine, Rusalka or Lorelei, and whatever animal, bird or fish she may resemble or metamorphose into, every mermaid we've looked at so far has been adult. Whether or not she is sexually active, she is sexually mature. That's the allurement and threat she poses to her predominantly male creators, audience, and, in fictional terms, husbands or victims. It was left to Hans Andersen to explore and invent the mermaid as child or adolescent. His story's been adapted so many times for stage, screen, spin-off, subversion and sequel that it's easy to forget how the original plot goes, so I'll run through it briefly now. A teenage mermaid rescues a prince from a shipwreck and becomes fascinated by the countries above the sea. Her grandmother tells her that mermaids live much longer than human beings, but humans have souls which go to heaven when their bodies die. The little mermaid says, "I would gladly give all the hundreds of years I have yet to live if I could only be a human being for one day and afterwards have a share in the heavenly kingdom." The only way she can achieve that, says her grandmother, is if a man loves her and marries her. Then would his soul flow into your body, and you would receive a share in the happiness of mankind. He would give you a soul and yet still keep his own. A pause to consider that idea. It wasn't something Hans Andersen made up. he got it almost certainly from Paracelsus, the alchemist and astrologer whose ideas provided the plot for Undine, and who, as I mentioned, was very interested in how nymphs interacted with mankind. His theory was that elementals, beings who live in water, air, earth and fire, have no souls, but can sometimes acquire them. Nymphs come to us out of the water, make themselves known and seen, and then return to their elements. Since the elementals resemble man, except in one respect, that they do not possess an immortal soul, it can be understood that if a nymph should appear to a man and he marries her, she can live with him and bear children. These children are then endowed with a soul because one parent, the man, is from Adam, and the other, i.e. the nymph, has received the gift of soul and immortality and become a human being by the sacrament of marriage and union with God and man. Exactly the notion that Hans Andersen puts in the mouth of the Little Mermaid's grandmother, who goes on to say, however, that no man will ever love and marry a mermaid, because what is thought most beautiful here below, your fishtail, they would consider ugly on earth. But the Little Mermaid isn't going to let that stop her. She wants a soul. She can have one if she gets the prince to fall in love with her and marry her. To do that, she needs legs. So she visits a witch and is offered a magic drink. Then your tail will split in two, the witch tells her, and shrink into what human beings call legs, but it will hurt you as if a sharp sword were running through you. No dancer will be able to move as lightly as you, but at each step you take, you will feel as if you were treading on a sharp knife and as if your blood must flow. Digression number 2. Hans Andersen is the first and still perhaps the only author to enter imaginatively into the pain a mermaid might feel if her tail were made legs. Folk stories may let us share a mermaid's grief for her lost freedom, but nobody else even hints at how much it physically hurts. One could guess that Andersen is using the fairy tale formula to talk much more explicitly about a teenage rite of passage than he could have done if he'd been writing about a human adolescent. The pain and bleeding associated with becoming a woman would have been taboo subjects in the 1830s, but because he's ostensibly talking about a mermaid losing her tail rather than a girl losing her virginity or starting her period, that's okay. Back to the story. In payment for her spell, the witch demands the mermaid's beautiful voice, which she takes by cutting out her tongue. So not only is she in agony, she can't communicate. More shades of our teenage years, unless that's just me. Dumb and in terrible pain, the mermaid reaches the palace, where she is kept as a kind of pet, allowed to sleep on a cushion outside her prince's door. The prince is very fond of her. He loves her as one might love a good, sweet child, but he's in love with a human princess, and that's who he marries. This isn't the Disney version. The mermaid doesn't get a husband, she just gets to be bridesmaid. Her sisters, meanwhile, long for her to come back to the sea. They bring her a magic knife, which they tell the mermaid must be plunged into the prince's heart, and his blood will turn her feet back into a fishtail. She can't bear to kill him. Instead, she throws the knife into the sea, then dives in herself and feels her body melt into foam, a mermaid suicide. Nevertheless, she does not die, but is transformed into a spirit of the air who can gain a soul by 3 centuries of good deeds. My feelings about that story have changed more than once. When I first read it as a child, I was moved to tears. When I revisited it many years later, I thought it was cruel. Now, looking at it in the context of contemporary mermaid legend, I find myself not exactly liking it, but certainly admiring it. You can call the story sadistic and moralistic. You can't call it misogynistic. The female characters are the ones with agency. And it's one of the very few attempts to see the mermaid's story from the mermaid's point of view. The Little Mermaid isn't weak by any means. She knows what she wants, a soul. She takes the only means she knows how to get it, and in the end she does get her heart's desire, even if not quite in the way she thought she would. Her non-death at the end, by the way, is Hans Andersen's idea of a happy ending. He was criticised at the time for not making his story quite bleak enough. From then onwards, there's a new divergence in how the mermaid is perceived, the Anderson model of a fundamentally pure virginal being as against more traditional views of the siren as temptress. Moving forwards into the 20th century, we can see this opposition at work, for example, in reactions to the 1948 film Miranda, starring Glynis Johns as a mermaid who exploits a string of lovers to get what she really wants, a baby. Some people found that outrageous. Men may adore and worship mermaids with a passion that is fully three-quarters carnal, but, declared the author, Alfred Gordon Bennett, they do not have sexual relations with them. Or if they do embark on this, one imagines, difficult and embarrassing experiment, they, unlike the film producers, have the finesse to keep quiet about it. He went on to remark that mermaids ought not to talk too much. They may and of course should sing every now and then, but they should not sing in any language a mortal man can understand. As so often for mermaids, I think we can understand women. Having reached the mid-20th century, I'll briefly sum up the story so far. Water spirits, male and female, with and without tails, living in fresh water or the sea, appear in the folklore of every country and every region. At a very early stage, legends in the Western world became inflected by the myth of the siren, who was originally a creature with the wings and claws of a bird, but over a long period of time became most usually imagined as a being with the lower half of a fish and the top half of a woman. Her function as temptress contributed to the sexualization of her imagery and the cannibalistic threat she posed to men, who nevertheless continued to portray her in places as seemingly inappropriate as churches and monasteries, as well as more obviously suitable contexts, such as maps or fountains. Supposedly authentic mermaids were widely portrayed and displayed between at least the 17th and 19th centuries. Many were artificial creations made from parts of different animals, including monkeys, fish, and chickens. Some were real animals, such as dugongs and manatees, as well as creatures whose nature we can only guess at from embroidered accounts and fanciful pictures. Meanwhile, legends of the mermaid developed to show her as either literally a femme fatale or as susceptible to man's domination, sometimes as both. She was very often a shapeshifter, her alternative forms sometimes seal, sometimes swan, sometimes fish or serpent-tailed, but in most, if not all cases, the essential factor in her alter ego was its animal nature. The underlying narrative here, quite clearly, is that woman is considered by almost exclusively male authors and artists to be fundamentally different, more primitive or primal, closer to the beasts than man. From the 19th century onwards, attempts have been made to see things from the mermaid's own angle, but the most significant example, Hans Andersen's Little Mermaid, overcompensated, turning her into a figure of soulful immaturity, in effect infantilizing her in the same way that women generally were infantilized by protective Victorian men. And the process was taken further in the late 20th century by Walt Disney, who pinned a more conventional finale onto his version of The Little Mermaid, allowing her to end up with her prince. Who, frankly, can blame him? But the result has been to make the mermaid not just touching and innocent, but cute, skewing her legend away from the more menacing and, to many of us, more interesting parts of her legacy. The darker side of mermaids still does get some attention. One of the Pirates of the Caribbean series features some real man-eaters, fanged like vampires. And Guillermo del Toro's recent film, The Shape of Water, has some interesting angles. Last time I talked about that, I was accused of giving spoilers, so I'll just say, see it and look out for the Little Mermaid references. In literature, young adult fiction has plenty of rebel mergirls, and several writers have examined sirens and selkies from an adult point of view. There's also an entirely new thing in popular culture, people dressing up as mermaids, learning to swim like mermaids, adopting a mermaid identity. Some of that might be just kitsch, but I think it's also to do with a more fluid attitude towards gender and sexuality. After all, what could be more fluid than a mermaid? So, take it all in all, the mermaid is probably as diverse today as she has ever been. For my final image, though, I'll revisit Victorian art with my title picture, Evelyn de Morgan's Sea Maidens, a rarity, one of very few 19th century mermaid paintings by a female artist. I like this a lot because it shows the mermaids as neither submissive nor threatening, neither vulnerable nor voracious, but a mutually supportive sisterhood. That's a good way to finish and hand over to you for any questions or comments.
Time for questions, but we've still got about 10 minutes or so, and we can wrap up.
You can always find me later if...
Yes, and Sophia very kindly said that she'll sign books later, and also if you want to come and talk to her throughout the day, we've got lots of opportunity. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to start with?
Was Hans Christian Andersen's plot based on folklore, or did he make it up?
He made it up.
Are there any stories about mermaids interacting with human women?
Oh, that's a nice... What, lesbian mermaids?
No, in general, just contact.
Just contact.
Also romance, but any kind of...
Gosh. There are certainly stories about mermen, or at least male selkies, interacting with women. That's quite a big theme in Selkie, the seal people. It's such a sexual relationship always that I think if you've got a human woman, you will always have a merman involved. I can't think of any legend that involves a mermaid and a human woman. There ought to be. It's a gap in the market.
I mean, they cannot be friends.
There's no friendship. I mean, there may well be in some modern literature that I haven't come across. It would be a nice thing if there were, but I can't offer, unless anybody else can come up with something, I can't think of anything in classical classical mythology or folklore that deals with that. I shall look for something though, because it's a nice idea.
I was wondering myself about how Melusine is often used by different families to establish a lineage.
Oh, yes.
I thought that might be quite interesting to mention.
Yes, people were very proud of their relationship to Melusine. The significant thing about the 14th century collecting of the earlier legends about Melusine was that it anchored it in a particular place and to a particular family, so it becomes the history of Lusignan, and it enables people to say, my great-grandmother was Melusine, and you might think people would be embarrassed about being descended from somebody who was half a serpent, but on the contrary, she became a figure, a protective figure, a glorious figure, somebody you could be really proud of being related to. So lots of French families altered their family trees to make it look as if they were related to Melusine. Yes, a good point. And even later on you find this with families in Ireland and the Western Isles of Scotland who are supposed to have some mermaid or selkie heritage. A lot of people are actually quite proud of this, although there are also examples of it being used as an insult to people.
You either get the webbed feet or you
yes,
get
exactly.
a goddess ancestor. So.
Yes, you might get both. You might get webbed feet and an ability never to be drowned, for example.
Didn't children have deformities of Melusine, as you're saying now?
Melusine's children did not. No, they were.
Remember two
No, you're right. Yes, it depends which version you're reading. You're quite right. In one version, they do become sort of mutant figures, don't they? And I can't remember what they do after that.
But people were perfectly happy with that.
Yep. Why not?
Any more questions at all? Oh, yes, yeah.
I think you talked about the connection between sort of like mermaid and the animal,
Mm.
the feminine sort of like animalistic creature. But is there, I was wondering, like a causal connection either way, like this idea of the feminine being connected with water?
I think there very much is, yes. I think the whole idea of, I was thinking about this just the other day, and this connection between between being female and the woman's element being water, and the tides being commanded by the moon, and the woman's cycle being commanded by the moon. I think there's a very essential link there. It's it's easy to get confused about it because they're also, of course, gods of the sea and so forth. But very much, I think this is why the mermaid becomes as she is. Well, yeah.
Since mermaid has been and has become a symbol for many different things, as you said, for temptation, sin, lust, and associated with the water, womanhood, music. I was wondering, is there also a possibility to see the mermaid as a symbol for deformity, so to link it to studies about having a monstrous body or something like that?
It's very rarely seen like that, if at all. You would think that it would be, but perhaps, as Victoria was saying, earlier, there isn't this stigma attached, or this sort of specialisation, because you don't really find that. Again, in modern terms, you could use that readily as a symbol, and a very good one too, because it becomes something potentially to be proud of. The mermaid's certainly never ashamed of her tail, and people very much accept her as the shape that she is and admire that for whatever reason. So I think that would be a modern interpretation rather than a traditional one.
I think in H.G. Wells's The Sea Lady, the mermaid in fact has a tail that is concealed beneath her big crinoline skirt, and she's carried around in a wheelchair, so she's a lady but is seen to, by society she's perceived to be disabled. But actually
And both Bette Midler and Lady Gaga do a mermaid in a wheelchair routine as
that's a good place to end.
good place to end.